Good afternoon. I'm Bill Jacobson. I'm the president of Kelly House this year, and I want to welcome you to our June gathering of Sunday Afternoon With. It's a program we try and run several months of the year where we get some of the people that have been around the community for a long period of time, and they can give us some of their experiences growing up and some of the interesting facts about the Mendocino coast. And we're lucky today to have Margaret Macdonald and her son Malcolm. And without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to you, and you can start in. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I am happy to have one of our family's descendants, his mother, Jane, went to school in Mendocino. That is David Payton over there, who taught school here in Mendocino. And his grandmother, Rose, was the daughter of my mother-in-law, Lillian MacDonald, whom I never had the privilege of meeting, but was very beloved by her mother. And also, I'm happy to see here one of the students, there may be more of them, of my sister-in-law, Georgiana MacDonald, who's sitting right over here, Tim Carto, who was, his family were close neighbors of the MacDonalds. That is, they lived only about 2 miles away, which was very close neighbors at that time. Can you people hear me? Yes. Because I really can't talk any louder. Okay, now I'm going to begin with how my family, on my own side of the family, got to America and eventually to the Mendocino coast. And I'm going to hold up here a picture of my great-grandparents. My great-grandparents on my mother's side, his last name was Vale, and Malcolm is going to hold it up because it isn't just because I'm nervous here. I do have a tremor, So I'll tell you a little bit about these people. I never met my great-grandfather. That picture was taken in 1890, and he died about a month after the picture was taken. But his great-grandparents, the Vales, came to America before America was a country. They came to Penn's Colony. His great-grandfather, Robert Vale, was the youngest son of a baron in Normandy. And he captained a boat for his father, going back and forth between France and London. Or it wasn't France then, it was Normandy. And while he was visiting or living part of the time in London, he was persuaded to become a member of the Friends group. Quakers, maybe you call them, the Society of Friends. So his father couldn't persuade him to join the true faith, which I presume, or to rejoin the true faith, which I presume was Catholic. And when he refused to do that, he disinherited him, took back his ship. And so Robert was living in London and teaching people, workmen at a night school for 2 or 3 years while the Society of Friends got together enough money to have a ship and outfit it so a shipload of friends could travel from not only London, some of them came from Ireland and Wales too, maybe some other countries for all I know. And he, because he was the captain of the boat, was allotted 1,000 acres in Penn's Colony in York County after he arrived over there safely. Apparently he was a competent sailor because they did get there safe and sound. But when they stopped in Dublin to pick up people there was a young woman named Sarah Bueller. And she had a big trunk with all her earthly possessions. But when she came, she was a Welsh woman. She lived in Wales. And she had come ahead of time to Dublin to get picked up. But when she landed in Dublin, her trunk was stolen from her. So all of her clothes, all of her possessions, her money was gone. But Robert, the captain of the ship, when he learned that, he said he would pay for her passage and, and outfit her with the things she would need. And so they came to America, and after they were here rather briefly in Penn's colony, they were wed in Warrentown in Pennsylvania. And my uncle Enoch, who became a Mormon in late life, researched the Vale family history. So we have a booklet of it at home that traces it all back. But the sons in this Vale family, like who would have been in England too, and Normandy also, I suppose, the younger son didn't inherit the property, the youngest one. He had to move onward and make his way westward or wherever. So that by the time my great-grandfather came along, they were living in Kansas. He was a musician, a professional musician that taught music lessons to people and got paid for it. He also performed wherever they needed musicians to perform. And his oldest daughter, who was my grandmother, also played with him, and his son, who was named Frank, he was Frank Vale, and his son was Frank Vale Jr., the oldest son, also played at dances or whatever. They had musical performances then. With the people in the picture here, which there's a whole batch of them, all of them, every single one, excepting one daughter who died before I was born, I have met and known them fairly well, and their children also. But besides the ones in the picture, there were two little boys. My grandmother is the oldest daughter there. There were two little boys, she told me, little Johnny and little Arthur, who died when they, I think, 3 and 5, something like that, each of them. They were among the younger children, but older than the tiniest ones there. And during that time, when they were little, there was a depression as far as the farmers were concerned, which affected the townspeople also. And my grandmother said they weren't able to afford to buy the appropriate food for the little children. And that's why she said they died. And I don't know that, but she certainly believed it. And so she determined that when she married, she would always have enough food for her family. And so they always had cows, they had chickens, they had rabbits, and they also had a lot of different kinds of fruits. And she preserved enough food every year in the summertime to last through 2 or 3 winters, up until the last year of her life, I would think. So that explains them. Now this is the picture of my grandmother, Mary Emily Vale Ward, and her husband and their children, of which there were 11 who grew up. And none of them had any of the fatal illnesses that were afflicted the coast at the same time, like the diphtheria, the smallpox, the whatever. But that may be because they lived inland and there weren't so many travelers. It also may have been because my grandmother was very, very careful about the water that she had for her family, and very careful about the way the milk was handled, and when she butchered her chickens, she always washed them right off in a mild solution of vinegar water. But at any rate, none of her kids died as children, or didn't die until they got fairly well grown up, for that matter. And that picture, maybe I should tell a little more about it. I put my notes down beneath so I could remember what I was going to say. That picture was taken just before they left Kansas to move via covered wagons, 2 of them, to Nebraska, in the Sandhills of Nebraska, not very far from North Platte. And I might point out, the pictures will go back on the table later on so you can look at them, but the little girl who's sitting there is my mother. She was 3 years old then, and the littlest baby girl was my Aunt Susie, and the youngest one, my Aunt Bessie, wasn't born yet. Okay. One of the older sisters there was a school teacher for a number of years. But all of their children I know quite well, and I talk with quite a few of them almost every single weekend on my cell phone, and it doesn't cost anything. And one of my uncles there was the world champion cowboy in the year 1934. He was Leonard Ward, and he also is rather renowned for being a survivor of Wake Island, a civilian survivor, which was quite hard to survive from during World War II. I brought some cowboy pictures here, and they're in the middle, and my uncle, and there's a picture of my mother down here in the corner milking a cow, and one of my uncles working on the farm. Those pictures were taken when, it's in 1919, right? My mother was 13, and they were taken just before their farm had to be sold at an auction to pay for the hospital and medical bills for my grandfather and the oldest uncle, who was grown up and had his own place separate, but who wasn't married yet. They were both injured very severely in a wagon accident when they were returning from the town of Paxton, or maybe Sutherland, which were about 30 miles away by very tough roads even yet. And the horses were spooked by an automobile. And horses and automobiles didn't relate too well together, and the wagon turned over and injured the both of them internally, and I think my grandfather had concussions of his head. Anyway, they were sent to the unit eventually when the local doctors couldn't do anything to help. They went to the university hospitals quite a distance, and eventually when they couldn't do any, but after several months, when they couldn't do anything more to cure either of them, they were sent home to linger away for about a year or so before they died. And you want to tell about my beloved Uncle Leonard?
Uncle Leonard, my mother's Uncle Leonard.
The cowboy one.
Is this boy here who always associated himself with the big brothers, even though his younger brother was, what, only 11 months younger. But he always said, you play with those little girls who were several years younger. So he was always bigger than he should have been. But by the time that of the accident with the wagon, he was 16, I believe, and all of these boys were, worked on a ranch, so they all were cowboys of a sort. He had already worked a little bit on other ranches, and the older brothers were working away from home, so he was the oldest at home. And he was given the task of driving all of their steers to the closest railhead and then taking them to Omaha to the big stockyard to make enough money to pay off the hospital bills that his father and oldest brother's injuries had
He had some
made.
cowboy assistants with this.
Yes.
They had hired hands on it.
And you should also know that even though he was 16, he was an extremely accomplished card player, at least in his own mind. But he was an extremely accomplished card player. But he'd already gone to Ogallala, the Sin City of Midwestern Nebraska, and taken some fairly serious money from real gamblers. So once he got the cattle to Omaha, which is a story unto itself, but he got them there, he had the best intentions and he got a bank draft in his father's name that he would, double or triple the money, and they would more or less be able to, buy back the herd and be better off than they were before, besides paying the doctor bills. And needless to say, he signed his father's name to the bank draft, and just like in a movie, lost it all. To the point where either the sheriff or the bank officer or both came to the Ward Ranch on the Sand Hills, and in one of the times when Grandfather Ward was cognizant, they asked him if he had signed this draft, and so he sort of had the choice of sending his son to jail, or they would end up losing all the money, and then a few months later they ended up having to lose the ranch at auction. At which point, after Grandfather Ward, my mother's grandfather Ward, and Uncle Bill passed away, which was soon after that, the ranch farm was auctioned, and Grandma Ward and most of the siblings, two of the sisters from the picture, the two oldest girls, had already married and were living in Nebraska. They stayed there. Yeah. The rest had to move away, and they moved to the southwestern corner of Utah, Iron County, correct?
Iron County.
Yes, and they homesteaded there in a place called Hamlin Valley, which my mother maintains was a beautiful place because it had oodles and oodles of pine nuts, and you could ranch cattle, and it had some places where you could have a still too, but that's another story. I'm not supposed to bring it up. In fact, one of the pictures was even cropped, so you wouldn't see it still underneath, but the truth will out. Having been there myself, but not in 1920-something, I couldn't see the beauty of the pine nuts. And it's totally surrounded by what's, escalante, a Spanish word for desert, for miles, for about 50 or 60 miles, and mountains on the other side. And Uncle Enoch used to say that in this area, even the jackrabbits carried canteens. And in 1922, in beautiful Hamlin Valley, that's where my mother was born. So I'll leave that part to her. I'm sure she remembers the birth.
And I remember the wagon ride to the little town, which really wasn't a town. What it was a location where the government of the United States sent a doctor, a woman doctor, to minister to the public health needs of this primitive area. And I think my mother had been to see her once before when she knew she was pregnant, but you had to ride over this very, very difficult road to get there. And my father and she had gone in the wagon about 3 months before I was scheduled to be born. And the wagon ride precipitated my premature delivery. And that doctor, who had her office in her little house, created an incubator out of God knows what, because she hadn't been provided with one, a baby incubator. and kept me and my mother both there for 2 months, and taking care of the two of us, during which the time my mother created a layette for me, which the things she'd had before were much too large. And I used to have my little bonnet, which would fit on the smallest teacup I ever had. I think I may still have it someplace. But I don't remember the doctor's name. I do have my birth certificate, but I don't think it put the doctor's name on. I have my father's and my mother's. Now this is my father, and he came to the United States. Can you see him? Holy mother. He came to the United States from Ireland. He lived in County Galway in a town that you call it Tina, but it's spelled T-Y-N-A-G-H. When we finally went to visit his relatives, that was after his death and my mother's death, visit his relatives in Tina. I pronounced it Tinach. I mean, how would you pronounce T-Y-N-A-G-H? And we had kind of a time clarifying that with the Irish, but we did find it, on the map, because Malcolm is a good map reader. At any rate, he came when he was quite a young teenager, and we do have at home, but I didn't bring with me, the documents that tell the ship he came on. He came with a younger sister, and they came to, eventually, though they came through Ellis Island, to Schenectady. That's the way you say it, to join an older sister, the oldest girl in the Fahy family, who had been there for 2 or 3 years and already had a job at her home. He got work immediately, I would think, as a water boy on the railroad, and then became a brakeman and eventually a conductor. And he was born in what, 1889? Yeah. And he worked on the railroads. It seemed to me, as he explained it, that in the wintertime they always had to go through like Montana and Minnesota and places like that. In the summertime they went through the desert country, so the brakemen were up on top of the cars. But, I'm sure this wasn't always the case, but that's the impression I got. My father talked Irish, Gaelic, and he could sing in it, and he could tell poetry in it. He also was fluent in English poetry, and he could dance. My mother, from the age of 13 on, after she was in Utah, went to work at what was the stateside, a hotel restaurant between Nevada and Utah, as a waitress. And the trains went past, and she met my father, presumably there, I guess, but also he had a homestead about a mile away from where my grandmother's homestead was. So they got married. They got married in San Bernardino, and when my mother was 15. And I was born her birthday's in April, and I was born when she was 16 and a little past, because I was born in July. My mother was a very adult-seeming person at the age of 13, I'm sure. She'd been playing back in Nebraska in the church. She played the organ. She played the violin, and actually she could play any stringed instrument she ever picked up, of which right now I will tell you I was a terrible disappointment to my mother, because I'm not musical, I can't dance, I always step on other people's feet, and also my mother could sew. She could look at in a magazine or newspaper, she could look at a dress, and she could put down a bunch of old newspapers and cut out a pattern that would fit her or me or whoever, and sew sew it, and she also could knit, and she could crochet, and she could tap. And I do none of those things very well. I used to make my little girls clothes, but they didn't look very professional ever. And but at any rate, after they didn't discuss this ahead of time, and I would advise the young. I don't know if there's anybody here young enough to need to be advised about this, but they didn't discuss about their family backgrounds and their religions. My maternal ancestors had started out as Quakers and had turned into rather liberal thinking Baptists by the time I was born. And my father was a very dedicated Catholic. After he was retired, he went to church every single morning if he was where a Catholic church was and there was Mass. And he was determined that his child was to be brought up as a Catholic. My mother was absolutely determined that this was not going to happen to a child of hers. So they, and my grandmother would have supported her. And so after, and another thing is they didn't discuss is where my mother was going to live. In order to keep a homestead, you have to have somebody living on it. And my father felt my mother should be happy to live on that homestead, which the nearest neighbors, their mother was 1 mile away, and the other nearest neighbors were 8 miles away. And this did not really suit my mother. She hadn't really cared for life in Nebraska too much on the farm. She had a very good friend in grammar school in Nebraska who was Margaret Sullivan, who later became a rather famous movie star. But Margaret Sullivan's parents gathered her up before my mother's family came with their losing their farm and things, and moved away so little Margaret Sullivan could go to proper dancing schools and to high school and to college or whatever. And she wanted, the mother of Margaret Sullivan, because they were best friends, wanted to take my mother with her. But my grandparents, would not hear of that. They thwarted her ambitions to also become a famous singer, dancer, whatever. But then my mother left my father, and she went and lived. First, she lived in Bingham Canyon for a while and worked there, but that wasn't exactly what she liked either. And I didn't bring the picture of me when I lived in Bingham Canyon, but if you saw the picture, you would understand why nobody wanted to live and work there forever. It worked, but it was not a city. So then she moved to Salt Lake City, and for 2 years she and I lived in Salt Lake City. And yeah, here is me when I was 4 years old with my mother in Salt Lake City, looking very happy and cheerful. My mom used to take me once a week to a movie in a theater that looked, compared with our theaters here, looked like a church cathedral practically, and there were silent movies, but there was a person who played the organ or piano or something. There also, this was either a Saturday or a Sunday, there was a live performance. One time it was a counting horse, and there were other sorts of things. Also, you got a raffle ticket when you went in, and my mother one time won, some prizes and things. We also, when we lived in Salt Lake City, and I lived with a Greek family, whom I still have a picture at home, which I didn't bring, of the lady's house. We lived with a Greek widow whose own children were going to school. And she was delighted to have little Margie with her. And my father had to pay by court order, $25 a month for my care. So that was given to this lady to take care of me. My mother worked as a waitress, and I used to sometimes get to go to the restaurant, which was kind of a little bit like a speakeasy restaurant. It was, they served alcohol discreetly there, though it wasn't legal in Salt Lake City. At any rate, I sometimes went and helped set up tables. But once a week, we would go on a little train, excursion train, that went out to the Salton Sea beside Salt Lake, and it had a playland there with all sorts of fun things. So I was quite happy in Salt Lake City, and frankly, I didn't want to come to California. And I didn't like it when I got here. I got the whooping cough. I was sick for a solid year with the whooping cough. I tore up the picture of me that was inadvertently snapped in the middle of one of my whooping cough episodes. But I didn't mention, Malcolm did mention this picture. We're going to put it in the back so you can see how I was cared for inadequately by my youngest Aunt Bessie, who was 12 years older than me. And she didn't like to have to babysit children, and she liked to tame Mustang horses. She did it very well. So my grandmother was very concerned that all of her daughters were going to have healthy children. So when one of her daughters lost one baby, shortly after it was born. I think it was from RH incompatibility, but they didn't know about that then. And so she went back by train to be with her daughter in Nebraska. And when this picture was taken, which I can put back there, my Aunt Bessie was taking care of me while my mother was working. And she turned into a fairly responsible woman, truly, considering.
Can we save that for later?
Yeah, this is a picture that I'm going to mention, and it will go on the back table too. After my mother and my father were both deceased, we visited, actually on 3 different years, my relatives in Ireland. And I have a lot of first cousins there who are the same age as my children. The reason for that is that my father's next oldest brother married a woman who was still alive when we were visiting there, who is 2 years younger than me. Irish men typically in Ireland at that time married much, much younger wives. She's a lovely person. She just that I call her Aunt Mary, and even though she's 2 years younger. And this picture is of her oldest daughter, Gabriel, and her husband, who is Pascal Henchy, and they live near Dublin, but in a separate town, and they live right next door to the ruins of an old abbey or church that is maybe 500 years old, and within sight of it there is another ruin that is twice that old. And on you go in back of their house, this is their house here, you can go down to the beach that is a very sheltered type of beach compared to the one on the Galway coast. Now, they're going to get me by my mother getting married in...
Remarried.
What?
Married again.
Yeah, getting married again to my stepfather, who was Harry Johnson, and he was working on the Hatch Hatchie Dam. He was an engineer, a steam engineer. He had, right out of high school, he had studied to become a steam engineer. He lived in Vermont then. possibly Massachusetts. Well, I may get a wee bit mixed up in that history. But in any case, he and my uncles, 2 or 3 of them, were working on this Hatch-Hatchie project together. And every 2 weeks at my grandmother's house, which is in Stanislaus County, her children and the neighbors and other people would gather at family dances, of which my grandmother's younger brother, Frank, would play a violin, and she would play perhaps the organ, pump organ, you know, that you, like a piano, you know, except you have to pump it. And then there would be some other people who played various instruments too, and they danced in the living room. And so these uncles of mine had invited this Harry Johnson to come down to the family dance. Well, my mother had this mistaken impression that Harry liked to dance, which dancing was her favorite recreation. And you know how men are. They deceive you. At any rate, she did after a bit. She hadn't before that completely gotten the annulment from her first marriage, but that was no problem because she was underage, and though she had her mother's consent, the annulment was granted rather easily. And then she married Harry, and we lived during my first year at school in Chinese Camp, which was an old gold mining town, but at that time was not much. It had quite a lot of ruins and one-room school. And I am going to put on the back table later on too, so you can leaf through it, this folder which has pictures of my stepfather's family. I had met his brother and sister who came out twice to visit us. They came to San Francisco, and we went down to meet them so they could come up and visit. And my step-grandmother, from the time I entered the family, wrote to me at least once a week, and I wrote letters back to her. She didn't have any other grandchildren, and I guess I was quite a precious person. She'd been a school teacher at one time, but her daughter, Harry's sister, his sister was younger than him, and his brother younger than him also. They had a shoe factory, and for his sister and her husband. And for all the years that I was going to grammar school, we were supplied with slippers because they were easy to kind of gather the size of your feet would be. And if we set good patterns, we could have had shoes too, I guess, but we did get slippers all the time. We got maple syrup and maple candy from the farms that this sister and her husband owned but didn't manage. And we also got subscriptions to a bunch of different magazines and books sent to me. So I gained this extra family. But I want to tell you a little bit about what happened to Harry's mother and his father when he was about 12, I guess. They had been living in either Springfield, Massachusetts, or in Chester, Vermont, or thereabouts, and going to dancing school, and he and his brother were in the church choir, little altar boys and things. The pictures are here of them, and dancing around the maple, that kind of thing. Then they went to Colorado Springs, where his father had a store. And there are pictures in this folder of the store, both inside and out. But after they were there a couple of years, and that would have been about, what, 1902, there came a horde of grasshoppers, of which the photograph of them is here too, in the streets in front of the store, up this high or so, and the wagon filled with grasshopper bodies, and Chinese could have lived well on that many grasshoppers. When I visited in China, I did have some nice, crispy, toasted, flavored grasshoppers. And it was a pity that these grasshoppers weren't put to some use, but the grasshoppers destroyed all the crops, and so nobody could buy anything, and so they moved back, back east, northeast. I won't bore you anymore with that, but those pictures, I have a whole carton full of pictures from my step-aunt that had saved and sent us, and also my stepfather had an album real full of pictures of where he had worked as a steam engineer. Some make you shiver to look at. You could believe really in global warming if you saw these pictures of California when he first came to California in the early part of this century, well, after the great earthquake, I guess. But in some of the northern places, there's icicles hanging down this far and the snow on the ground. Malcolm will confirm that, right? It's very, very sad. Okay, so I am not married, but my mother is married to Harry Johnson. We go first the year that I'm 6 in July to visit the ranch that he had bought during the time when he was married to his first wife, who is, I don't think he ever mentioned her to my mother before that, but he might. At any rate, the house is there. It used to be long. It was built for the Stearns.
Where is the house?
What?
Where?
It's at Sunny Slope. And Sunny Slope is 2.5 miles from Keene Summit. Some of you know where Keene Summit is. But it's on the railroad track and not on the county road. And if you went by road, you go one way, that's 2.5 miles. If you go up the railroad track and around, 2.5 miles also. First year, we only went for like about 2 weeks. And that was in the summer for vacation. And then the next year, we moved up there, and I started to go to school at Keene Summit. The first year I went to school at Keene Summit, which would have been when I was 7, and in 1929, I rode to school on this thing, which was a converted Ford truck, which had been made to go on the railroad.
What state are we in?
The man who drove it, his name was Al Barnes. At the time that picture was taken, he was still living, I believe, in Albion, and he would come up just his route going toward Navarro, just coincided perfectly to get me to school on time. And as long as I was in, by the time I was 7, I was in 3rd grade. And in 3rd grade, and maybe in 4th, I could get out early. So I could ride home on that thing too. But then when I got advanced to 5th grade, the next year on, I had to walk home. And then shortly after that, the thing discontinued running. The railroad didn't have it going any longer. It not only took me to school, but it would bring you your mail, and if you wrote out a grocery list, they would get the groceries for you and deliver them to you. It was, handy for people who lived along it. Also, our cream from the people milked the cows, they separated the milk, and they sold the cream, and the cream could go on that thing be sent down to Petaluma eventually. Now, this is a picture that was taken at Sunny Slope, which is 7 miles up the river from our home. And in it, I am
up the Albion River.
Up the Albion River, yeah. I hope you're all realizing that Sunny Slope was on the Albion River. Where I live now is on the Albion River, but the Sunny Slope is 7 miles further up what used to be the railroad track from where our home is.
Where was the school?
Pardon?
Where was the school that you attended?
Pardon?
Where was the school that you attended?
At Keene Summit. Do you know where Mickey Smith lives?
Yes.
On
Yeah.
the Flynn Creek Road.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
The top of it.
Right.
So,
Okay, and I do want, when the picture gets back there, that you look at these fish, because they were fished out of the Albion River below our house at Sunny Slope in July, caught by me. And not so much because of caught by me, but because of the changes in the river. There is no way that any fish that big could possibly be in that river in July. Well, not probably maybe since Masonite came, but certainly not since Louisiana Pacific were doing their logging. This is a picture of my husband and me the first summer after we were married. We were married in October the 17th of 1941. And this picture was taken by my mother the next year. We caught these fish in the same part of the river that the fish, with little me here, were caught. And fish this size they couldn't survive there during the summer. Be lucky if minnows could. What?
Can we go to the Robertsons now? Can we go to the Robertsons now?
Not quite.
Okay.
Going back there with these pictures of the fish, it's going to be a picture that is taken of Sunny Slope,
Here,
an aerial photo by Nicholas Wilson in
about 1989.
Okay, and that shows the clear cuts on the surrounding hills around Sunny Slope. And I thought that was particularly important, was how it affected the river, that part of the river, because Boltine Gulch, when I was a child, which was a gulch that was just above my parents' home, had fish going up it that went up a little waterfalls, and I used to love to watch them. And actually, there was a time, before I learned that fish had feelings, that I used to spear the salmon that were migrating up with a pitchfork. I'd take off my shoes and tuck my skirts inside my panties and catch the fish on the pitchfork and put my hands in their gills and fetch them out. And they were smoked and very good eating. But at any rate, I'd not only like to catch them, but I like to look at them. And it's very poetic almost, watching fish going up little waterfalls. Now, the area that feeds into this Boltine Gulch to this very day has no homes on it, none whatsoever. It's the only thing it has is, forest trees, and it's had extensive logging. And that is why I want you to look at the Nicholas Wilson photo, aerial photo, very carefully. And I think you could understand what has happened to a lot of the fish that used to be in the Albion River. Now we can go on to...
We can go back to the Robertsons. In 1849, the other side of the family started its way west. John Robertson was my great-grandfather, my father's mother's father. And at the age of 20, he left his home in Ontario, the part of Ontario that's almost touching Michigan, and came all the way to California, as so many other people did in 1849. I don't know if he was looking for gold or just figuring to make money off of other people, because once he had been here at almost any short amount of time, he turned to being a stockman, and he herded and sold everything from turkeys to oxen and almost everything in between that in size. He went back and forth after 1849 back to Ontario to, I imagine, to court his sweetheart, Jane MacNeil, who he eventually married in 1852, and their first child was born in 1854. And from this whole period from 1849 to 1859, he was traveling back and forth, scouting for wagon trains, and was almost conscripted into the U.S. Army, even though he was a Canadian citizen, and only escaped by...
That was before he got married.
That was before he was married. It was in the first couple of years, thank you. He only escaped by taking the amount of money he was owed in gold in the middle of one night and cutting loose all of the horses from that outpost and hoorahing them across the plains, and then making his own way away from that outpost. In California, when he was first there, he sort of disdained the offer of becoming a partner with Charles Crocker, which may not have been the best economic decision, but on the other hand, he was somebody who'd probably rather be a scout for wagon trains and be a stockman than be tied down to the Big Four. So eventually, once they had 3 children back in Canada between 1854 and 1859, a boy and 2 girls, and somewhere around that point, he convinced his wife, Jane, that they were going to go west to California and settle there. Or he was going to take the oldest boy with him, and she wasn't going to allow that to happen. Something to that effect happened. So by 1860, they were settled in El Dorado County, and the next 5 children were born there from 1860 to 1873, although they being the Robertsons, had already come up to the Willits, what would have been called Little Lake then, area in the late 1860s, because he was on the census in Little Lake, or Willits, in 1870. So I don't know why the last 2 boys were born in El Dorado County in 1870 and 1873, or at least that's the way it is on the paper. Now Kenny, he lived there for some time. And in Westport, one time he was on a Saturday night playing cards. It seems to run on both sides of the family, for money. And a man had come in earlier to play who, did not have any calluses on his hand and wore gloves and a really fine suit, and was obviously, not one of the woodsmen or cowboys or cattlemen or anything. And he proceeded to start winning much too often, and Uncle Alex Robertson,
he came up with it, more aces.
Yeah, he had too many aces than there were counting the other players and the rest of the deck. And Uncle Alex dispatched him with his firearm. And there was no inquest, nothing held, because it was just ruled immediately justifiable homicide. And at or about that same time, in 1880, John Robertson and his next to youngest son, John Finley Robertson, who was then 10 years old, had brought a load of turkeys. Sometimes they actually herded the turkeys across on foot, but these were put into coops or boxes and brought over to probably Pine Grove, which is south of Casper, north of here, east of Point Cabrillo Lighthouse. And it was a pretty booming woods camp at the time. It was really a town.
They
had a racetrack and, as my grandmother said, a cursed brewery that she was forced to work at temporarily once.
She didn't work at the...
No, she worked at the hotel connected with it. Anyway, they had brought over these turkeys and had been paid for them, and were heading back to Willits, to Little Lake, with the money, the 10-year-old boy on a wagon, and great-grandfather Robertson on a horse. And at one of the crossroads east of here, they were accosted by 2 of the Frost brothers, The Frosts were a family from the Potter Valley, Little Lake area, who'd been in a family feud with another family for generations. And I guess to fuel their feud, they needed some money, so they probably knew about John Robertson, buying and selling stock, and that he would have money, so they came out on their horses with their guns drawn and forced Grandfather Robertson off of his horse, and he was to give up his money. At some point, the newspaper accounts say his horse reared up and discharged its firearm, mortally wounding one of the Frost brothers. At which point, the other brothers surrendered, accompanied them back to the sheriff, and vouched for the justifiable shooting of his brother by the horse, which may be true, and it may be that the 10-year-old John Finley Robertson sitting on the wagon wasn't really noticed, and being a Robertson, he may have had a firearm, and he may have been the one that shot and killed one of the Frosts.
3 newspapers in the county that reported it all the same way. They did have an inquest, and the inquest jury decided, actually the surviving brother testified that
it was the horse. Happened. And they didn't jail the horse because it didn't justify. But almost as soon as he made any money working in the woods, the younger John Robertson, John Finley Robertson, Uncle John as he's known in the family, even though he's my great uncle, acquired his own permanent, large, long-barreled Colt revolver and kept it with him the rest of his life. And some of his closest neighbors and family, if they came after dark, were almost killed by it because he was a little suspicious of strangers, I'm sure because of that incident. My grandmother, Lily Robertson, the older sister of the John Finley who was with the shooting horse, as I said, had to work next to the Cursed Brewery, and she was working there in the mid-1880s. She was born in 1867, and at a dance or some kind of get-together in the area at the hotel or the brewery, she met this good-looking young woodsman. More accurately, he was sort of what we today would be a contract logger.
But he was a timber cruiser.
Yes, a timber cruiser also, and I don't know how long their courtship lasted, but in February of 1887, Lily Robertson married John Daniel MacDonald, M-A-C little d. And a little over a year later, I'm sure Bama would want people to know that, more than a year after they were married, their first child, John Daniel MacDonald, who was known as Jack, or Johnny when he was little, was born at Gunnery, which was a woods camp about 3 or 4 miles east of where the MacDonald Ranch is now on the Albion River. They had, when they were first married, they lived in a cabin on John Robertson's property that he bought, which would be on the Albion Cutoff Road between Highway 1 and the Little Airport Road. Right.
Albion.
If anybody knows where Jim Sansey or the Lawrence brothers lived, that was his property at one time. It was bounded by Dark Gulch on the west and the Albion Lumber Company mostly everywhere else. There's no real history of the MacDonalds or Robertsons after this point without having just a quick overview of the Albion Lumber Company and the people who ran it, and I mean quick, not like, well, never mind. The first real lumber company there was run by Mr. MacPherson. Of course, he was a real robber baron, so maybe his McPherson street name in Fort Bragg is justifiable. But he was a MacPherson, M-A-C little p, a true Scotsman himself, who sort of took advantage of the Captain Richardson of Richardson Bay and acquired his rancho grant from the Spanish government or from the Mexican government, or a chunk of it, all of the land along the Albion River. and I don't know how it could work this way, but when the ranchos, when they were deciding once they became California whether the ranchos were legitimate or not, Captain Richardson's Albion rancho, his Sausalito rancho, was ruled legitimate. His Albion one was illegitimate, yet by this time McPherson had it. Even though it was an illegitimate grant, McPherson maintained all of his claim and kept it. I think that was because he paid his lawyers a lot more than the little settlers on the side who were claiming their portions. Anyway, McPherson ran the Albion Lumber Company by himself till the 1860s. Then a man named Henry Weatherby became his partner. And when McPherson died in 1879, Weatherby ran it by himself with a general manager named Miles Standish, who was the 8th Miles Standish, going directly back to the Miles Standish of the Pilgrims. And then Standish and his partner Henry Hickey bought out Weatherby in 1891, and the name was changed from either Weatherby's Mill or was McPherson and McPherson and Weatherby, Albion Mill. Then it was called the Albion Lumber Company after Standish and Hickey bought it out. And John MacDonald, my grandfather, the man who married Lily Robertson, was a timber cruiser both for Weatherby and then for Standish and Hickey, and for the Albion Lumber Company when it was still called that, but it was bought by the Southern Pacific Railroad so they could make enough ties to build a railroad across Mexico. That was the chief reason that they bought it in 1907. And Standish and Hickey went off and formed their own company after the summer of 1907, and John MacDonald timber cruised for both the Albion Lumber Company and for Standish and Hickey. And for those, most of you probably know what timber cruising is, but for the few that don't, that means you go out into the woods in a specific block of land, whether it's a few acres or 40 acres or 160 or a whole section, and decide how much timber is there, how much of it is marketable, and how much it is going to be worth. And in doing that, John MacDonald went all over this part of Northern California, making timber cruise maps and sometimes even surveys for Standish and Hickey and the Albion Lumber Company. What else should I say here? The MacDonald's children, the first one, as I said, was Uncle Jack, born in 1888, followed in 1890. Once they moved onto what's all but 40 acres of the same property that is the MacDonald Ranch today, that's where Uncle Charles MacDonald, was born in 1890. Followed by their sister Muriel in 1893, another sister Rose in 1898, and with the same mother and father, skip all the way ahead to 1907, my father Lorne was born, 19 years younger than his oldest brother, and 2 more years later, Uncle Forrest, the baby of the family, was born. And Lily Robertson-Macdonald, who is sort of the heroine of the Robertson-Macdonald side of this, raised children from 1888 until the middle of World War II because, and mostly by herself, well not mostly, but in 1916 John MacDonald died and she was left with these 2 little boys. Fortunately, her second oldest son, Charles, for 80 acres of the, it's kind of a, what would be the word? Encouragement to stay home. He was given 80 acres of the ranch and stayed home as kind of, he promised to take care of the little boys as kind of a, big brother, uncle, father figure. So he's sort of a living saint in the family, or not living now, but was then for doing that. And Rose MacDonald, my father's sister, had 2 children in the mid-1920s and then died in 1930 with a 6-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son, who then came back to the ranch to be raised by Lily and Robertson-Macdonald, who everybody in our family knows as Bama or Bam, because one of the first grandchildren couldn't pronounce grandma and it came out Bamaw.
You might point out that Rose was the grandmother.
Rose is the grandmother of Dave, who's sitting in the second row with
Francine.
Yes, Francine, and with the necklace that has the bare teeth of bears that John Robertson Sr.
The grandmother
dispatched.
And after fishing for 2 days without any luck, I wish I had had this.
So Bamaw was raising children from the time of Jack's birth till when Dave's mother and younger brother were finishing high school, when they went to live in Little River with Uncle Forrest.
But you might mention that Charles built a cabin for himself on our property.
Right, where he lived. And
his mother's property, where he spent his weekends, and his wife and their son Byron spent their vacation time.
all right, a couple of the anecdotes about the Macdonalds are that in about 1910, Uncle Jack was working for the railroad, or the lumber company, which was one and the same at that time. And a log or a chain broke loose and pinned one of his legs against the railroad car, more or less crushing it. And in those days, if you were injured, the best you could hope for was that in the woods or along the railroad. If it was on the railroad, you hoped that the train was quickly going, to town, down to Albion. Some of the people who were hurt in the woods were brought to my grandparents' house and just deposited on the sofa or the table, because that was the closest place to be cared for. But so Uncle Jack was taken to Albion. There was a hospital and a doctor there at that time. And Uncle Charlie worked in the slaughterhouse for the Albion Lumber Company. It was such a big part of the community that they had a slaughterhouse about a mile or so down river from where our ranch is. And he took the train down, and once he got there, the doctor told him that Uncle Jack's leg was crushed so badly that he was going to have to amputate it. And I don't know if he had his gun from the slaughterhouse with him, or he just said, without the gun, that if you take his leg, if anything happens to his leg, I'm going to shoot you. You're going to operate and save his leg. So he stood over the doctor while he did whatever he could do, and he saved Uncle Jack's leg. And Uncle Jack, even 35 years later, was packing these huge bales of ferns out of places where you wouldn't, because there's no trail. It's the side of a hill in the middle of nowhere.
But his younger brother, my husband, would carry one bale. But Uncle Jack carried 2 bales with his injured leg. He never really mentioned it.
What were they doing with the ferns?
My parents, when they were first married, and my father even before that, during the Depression in the 30s, made part of his living. And when my parents were first married, they picked ferns, and you'd bundle them up and in these huge bales, and you would sell them to
Avancino Mortensen in San Francisco.
Yeah, just florists in the city. And that's what led to sort of indirectly, directly to my father being what we sort of called the great fern hunter, being through his work with 4-H is the real reason. He got involved with creating thousands and thousands of Christmas wreaths and garlands for the city of Fort Bragg and for lots of places in San Francisco. I mean, we could spend an hour just talking about that. And that was very arduous work, which my mother took part in for the first decade or two of her married life, where you would spend a couple of months before Christmas, 12-hour days of just constantly wrapping, either cutting things to become part of the wreath, and then wrapping them around on these 12-inch circles, more metal forms, sometimes bigger than that. It looks nice, but the work is pretty hard.
And there were miles of garland.
Yeah.
They used to decorate the streets of all the good-sized towns between the light posts with redwood garland.
A couple of quick items. Just the John Finley Robertson that was the 10-year-old boy that either was the shooter or witnessed the shooting horse. This is his whiskey jug. Little brown jug. Yeah, the little brown jug, right. Maybe a little blacker than brown, but that he would carry to Albion and get refilled once a week.
Or to Little River.
Or to Little River. And before John Macdonald was married in the early 1880s, he was doing this logging contracting and sometimes doing their own chopping. And he worked with a man named Jack Riley. It's spelled the same way as Riley Heights in Anderson Valley. I'm not sure if they're direct descendants or not. And there's a 15-foot stump just east of our property that
On the river.
on the river, right next to the river, more or less, that Jack Riley chopped down by hand with his axe in 3 days, which was quite a feat in the 1880s. Wow. And in those days, if you had lumber and you wanted to make sure it was yours, sometimes you had to brand it just like cattle were. So we still have this chunk of wood with an R on it, branded in. Most people think it's R for Robertson, but it's from the days of the Macdonald-Riley partnership mostly around the Albion River.
You should mention how the logs got down, why they had to be branded.
Right, because they were sent down the river, on the river, in the river, and you would wait for a freshet, a rainstorm, and
they opened the dam.
They would open the dams. There was a dam about 6 miles up the river from our place. That was the major dam on the Albion River, and they would be fresheted down to the boom, which is about 3 miles of winding river from Albion. A little trivial side thing about the Albion Railroad, which went right by the Macdonald place, completed just about the time that the Macdonalds settled in there permanently. Until 19-something, the railroad only ran down to that boom. It ran all the way out to Wendling, or Navarro, as we call it now, but it didn't go to the mill. The last 3 miles from the boom to the mill weren't completed until 1903, even though Mr. McPherson had started there 50 years before. What other little tidbits? What have I left? Oh, I should hold this to remind myself. It's Uncle John Finley Robertson, who I just call Uncle John. Until I was more or less grown up, I was sure that I had known him. It was only when I saw his death certificate that he allegedly died 7 years before I was born that I figured out otherwise. But when I was small, I would get the usual bedtime stories, but I would always ask for an Uncle John story. And there were, I don't know how many of these Uncle John stories, but a lot of them about his days working in the woods and different, calamities that befell people. And probably the best story is about Uncle John was, like many men then, was a tobacco chewer, and he was quite the spatter of his tobacco. He could, this room wouldn't contain him at all. He would be down to the Ford House with a good spat into the wind. And there came into the Albion region a new woods boss. Uncle John was a chopping boss, in charge of a crew of choppers. And there came a new woods boss to that part of the Albion woods, and the rumor came up the river before him that he fancied himself to be quite the tobacco spatter, and that he had heard of John Finley Robertson's spatting prowess, and that there was to be a contest. So on a Saturday when they knocked off early in the afternoon, on one of the landings way up on Albion Ridge, probably near Kieran Calvert's property now, so quite a ways upriver from the Macdonald Ranch, Uncle John and the woods boss had to have a contest, but people had found out that this woods boss was pretty touchy, and he'd kind of hinted that if he didn't win this contest, John Finley's chopping crew might be in danger of, losing their jobs. So the woods boss got to go first by flip of a coin or something, and he spat pretty far across, the landing, and everybody went, oh, great, oh, that's pretty good. I don't think you've ever seen anything that far. And so John Finley Robertson gauged, like how far that was, and he let out a big high arcing one that landed just about 5 feet short of the woods boss's spat. And so everybody slapped the woods boss on the back and, congratulated him and, maybe even carried him off the landing. And once his back was turned, John Finley was, he was a little crotchety at times, and he was a little cranky that he had to throw the spatting contest. So he let out with a good one, and there was a little breeze blowing down the river, so he turned around. And he was a bachelor all his life, so on a Saturday afternoon, he would go down to his sister Lily's house to have dinner. So when he just marched right off from the landing and marched straight home to Bama, his sister Lil's house. And when he got there, she said, "Oh, John, glad to see you. How was work?" And he said, "I was starting to bake your favorite apple pie, but I don't know what happened. There must have been a sudden storm. It's a beautiful day, but something came down the chimney and just all this dust and ashes got all over your pie, so it was ruined." There are many other stories which typical of our family, even though my mother, of course, isn't really a Macdonald, she's a, Fahe. She's the one that told me the stories of Uncle John, night after night after night.
The thing is that when my children, the two older ones, were little, Uncle John, John Robertson, and his brother Will used to vie for my attention. They would walk to Albion, carry a milk bucket size each, pick huckleberries on the way back, and present me with their huckleberries, which were picked so clean you didn't have to clean them after you got there. And all they wanted was a piece of pie if I baked one. But Uncle John insisted on sitting in front of my fireplace, and though I got him a can, an empty coffee can, to use for a spittoon, he never would use that. He would spit into the fireplace. Now, he hit the fireplace, though, but he would be clear across our living room, which was good sized. But I had lots of people tell me stories. The Jack, he's Malcolm's uncle, but I didn't call him uncle, and he would tell me stories about John Finley. And William was quite a different sort of person. He collected butterflies and moths, and he used to entertain Malcolm's oldest sister Mary with identifying the various plants and things around and the herbs that were good for this and that, and wild ginger root. Naturally, he raised butterflies and moths at one time and sold their cocoons and stuff, things like that. We have a great big butterfly moth book that was his that he gave to Mary. And there are two different personalities entirely.
I feel that everybody's been so patient here. We can go on forever, but I don't want to outstay. So we should open it up to questions.
Okay, yes. One you missed about your dad. I remember in the early 30s, he was attending the animals, and the bull came up behind him, and its long horns came right around him and pushed him against the barn wall and held him there. Do you remember have you heard about that?
No.
Yes, quite a while. He was able to escape. But there's a lot of stories, like about the slaughterhouse, all about that slaughterhouse, how they used to keep Do you have any history on that?
Yeah.
Was that on your property or just below your
No,
property?
that's on the company's property. It was the Albion Lumber Company's
Which was
slaughterhouse.
a little bit below your property?
Yeah, approximately a mile or so.
Now, is there still some of that old slaughterhouse left there?
I was just looking at a picture of, to answer that question, there was a slaughterhouse, which, you know, they had hundreds of cattle to feed the employees of the lumber mill. And there was also a company house owned by the Albion Lumber Company that could be used by the captains of the schooners that came to carry the lumber back to San Francisco. And one of the MacDonald's closest friends was a Captain Lilyland, who was the captain of one of the main schooners that went back and forth. And all of his children would come up in the summertime and spend their summers at the company house, which was just west of the MacDonald Ranch. And after the mill shut down at the end of the 20s and Southern Pacific stopped using the mill and using the railroad and transferred all the property to the Southern Pacific Land Company, they were afraid that hobos and people like that would start living in the company house. And there's a picture back there, I think, of the company, this beautiful redwood house, and they burned it to the ground.
But there also was a house by the slaughterhouse.
There was a house by the slaughterhouse that a family named the Pipers, who lived in and ran the slaughterhouse, that Uncle Charlie worked as an assistant for Matt Piper, the person who worked at the slaughterhouse for the longest period of time.
Did the MacDonald's supply cattle for the slaughterhouse?
The MacDonald's and the Albion Lumber Company herd kind of mixed together in the, not exactly so, but they bought some of their cattle. Well, this is our first disagreement. We were sure we were going to get into like a fight over family history here, so I will bow to her on that.
Yeah, I think, as I heard it, the MacDonald's cattle are definitely separate. The cattle that the company got, they usually bought very low-grade cattle,
yes,
on purpose, and they butchered them to use in their cookhouses and things. And as my mother-in-law told me, that is how TB got introduced into the cattle on the property, but not because they bought those kind of cattle or mixed them, but they lived right close to each other, the cattle
Right.
did. And they may be
They grazed in the same areas, that's what I mean.
And my husband, as a small boy, then got bone tuberculosis and was treated for several years at the Shriners Hospital in San Francisco, which his mother had to take him to and fro on the ship that went out from Albion, and she hated ships, and she always got seasick. And then he had to stay in the hospital. When he was in the hospital for months on end, his first cousin, who was the daughter of Lily MacDonald's oldest sister, the first cousin's name was Helen McKnight. She lived in San Francisco with her husband, and she used to go every day and visit with little Lorne and help him with his schoolwork so he could keep up with it. And when he came home the first time and was supposed to recuperate with just going back for aftercare, he swung himself over the fences with his crutches, quite uncontrollable. I'm sure his mother told him not to. His father would have been dead by then, right?
No, it was before his father died.
Well, in any case, his father was sick with the throat cancer. At any rate, he broke the cast, and so then he had to go back and have his hip reset, and it took another couple of years to heal up. However, and I'm sure he would want this known, that when he went to high school, he participated in track, and he won a gold medal, which I have someplace at home, for being the best runner in some division of so many yards or feet or quarter of a mile in not only this county, but the whole northwestern quarter of the state. And he was very proud of that. He also played tennis at high school, and they had a tennis court there when he went. And he played baseball, and he loved all these kind of sports. And he walked faster than most anybody that I knew. He walked faster uphill than downhill. One leg was always 2 inches shorter than the other after the surgeries.
I should say, to accentuate the kind of person that he was and the forebears, there's a letter here that I won't read, but the main point is it's a letter from Uncle Alex, the oldest of the Robertson children, who was born in 1854. And this letter is from 1932, when he was 78, to his sister Lil. And he's living in Branscombe, I believe, or in that area. And he's writing about the 300 posts that he just sold to a man from Sacramento. 300 posts that he had split himself. The posts are 7 feet long by about 4 by 5 or 4 by 6 inches. And the man is coming back to get a couple hundred more. So he had just split 500 posts recently, and he was writing to her, amongst other things, about that, which reminded me that when my father was only 73, I was fresh out of college and living at the ranch with him. I was fresh out of college, and he was 73. Maybe I said that backwards. I know I look 73. He cut down one of the oldest second growth redwoods on our property. He cut it down with a chainsaw. I mean, this is a good size second growth redwood on a steep hill, because Bill Jacobs of the Jacobs family, if people know them, who by then lived in Santa Rosa, needed 300 or 400 posts. So we cut down this huge second growth redwood on this side hill down in a gulch on the edge of our property, and he cut the tree down, and he did anytime there was fine splitting to do on the posts, and even occasionally I did most of the packing out, but he certainly did his share for being 73 years old. And I can remember vividly when he was about 83, and we were loading a pickup load of firewood, the day, the moment, the look on his face when he said, "I think you need to finish loading it, because I'm just not feeling up to it," which was a watershed in my life. My 83-year-old father, I just took for granted that he could still do all of those things. And one quick thing to show you about Uncle Charlie and these boys. Bama, my grandmother, occasionally got to go visit one of her sisters in the valley, usually Potter Valley, and one summer, or Willits, yeah. And one summer in 1921, when the 2 little boys, Lorne and Forrest, my father and Uncle Fergie, or Huck, as some people knew him, were left home with Uncle Charlie, and he wrote a letter over to Bama to let her know everything was all right. And a little bit of Uncle Charlie's note to her says, from July 15th, 1921, "Dear Mother, everything is fine and dandy here. The boys are going to write to you, so guess they will tell you about such and such and such and such." So you can picture these. So then my father, the 14-year-old, writes, "Dear Mother, everything is all right. Everything is all right yet. We have not burnt out or died of starvation yet. The old chicken hatched out 12 little ones. They are all right so far. Frank was up here this evening after plums. They are almost they're all over the trees now. Mrs. Coombs," that was his teacher, "was not cranky today, so had an easy time. I suppose you're having a fine time over there eating watermelons and things." Sounds more like a 4-year-old than a 14, but anyway. The younger brother, the 12-year-old, writes, August 15th, he couldn't even get the month correct. "Dear Mother, hope you are fine and eating lots of watermelon." I wonder whose paper he cheated off of. We have not starved yet, and everything is all right, and hasn't burned up yet. Lorne thinks he is some chicken raiser. They are all bantams. They have feathers. They have feathers on their legs. And he concludes with, gosh, it's hard to write a letter. We are all fine. I have nothing more to say, so I'll close. Forrest. That pretty much captures Forrest right there. Any other questions?
Yes, one other. Your uncle, Uncle John, you know, he was a very kind person. He would let us come down and pick all the plums we could carry. We had to carry them all the way to the top of the hill.
Maybe that was your family coming up with plums.
Yes, absolutely. Every year we'd go down and get plums, and we'd swim in the river. And now we should point out how, you know, we can all, as we get older, the problems we can have. Now, he was a very good wood chopper. Still, when he went to cut that limb, I don't know what age, maybe you have his age, but he went to cut that overhead limb, and he couldn't hold on to that handle as tightly as he used to when he was younger. And his hands came off, and the axe came down on his head. Do you have information?
Yeah, I knew about that.
On that?
Yeah.
So how long did he last after that? It wasn't very long.
No, he did. Quite.
Did he?
Yeah, he lived to be 86 or 7. So.
Even after that accident?
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't hear much more about it.
He didn't even mention it.
Yeah, it was just another day in the woods for him.
Yeah, this uncle is his great uncle.
Yeah.
Actually, John Finley used to go hunting with my husband after we were married, and he literally shot his deer, which he never failed to do, with his handgun. And his hands, like you said, were sort of jiggly, worse than mine are now. But somehow he could hold it still at the critical moment. And he would never shoot a deer excepting right in the back of their heads. He liked the neck of the deer. That was his favorite part of the meat. And anybody who would stoop to shoot a deer in the chest part or the abdomen, I mean, they didn't go hunting with my husband or Uncle John or any of our family. I mean, you shot deer so you could have meat to eat, and also the horns to put on the outside wall, but you didn't just, just shoot them any place, and you didn't shoot them unless they were legal bucks, and up north there they had to be 3-pointers or more.
Any other questions?
The Macdonalds were quite academically inclined. Like your dad was always involved with education, like 4-H club, and I remember once when I bought a University of California group down on the river, and he gave us a very nice talk. And now your uncle Jack, he married a school teacher, teacher of
your teacher.
Pardon me?
Your teacher.
Yeah, that's right. She was my teacher.
Amongst many others, yes.
Yeah. And the other Aunt Lenora, married Charles. She also was a teacher. They both taught at the McKay School, the one that was down close to our house.
This is a very short comment. There's the paper to prove it. This is about John Robertson and the Albion Investment Company. Letterhead says capital $25,000 in 1903. And they're writing to him. Miles Standish was one of the directors, along with his partner Hickey. They're writing to him on December 31st. John Robertson, Esquire. Dear Sir, we beg to advise you that the sum of $1 has been deposited to the credit of your account, being for interest in your to date for this year. That's how honest they were, I guess.
We shouldn't let the day go by without mention of Jim Boyle. You did mention him earlier as one of the 2 children. My mother and my uncle lived at the home ranch, and I wonder if everybody here knows the physicalness of that situation, because you could either access it from the river, which no longer would be possible, but you could walk up the old river road or whatever, or from the airport road, And it was a very imposingly steep road at one time. And there was no mention of the garden either, that it was a big venture and all the berries and everything. But Uncle Jim and my mom walked to school up that hill every day. And Jim told me many years later that he had either absolutely perfect or very nearly perfect attendance, because at home he would get castor oil or something worse if he seemed to think that he wouldn't go to school that day.
Castor oil was the nice ingredient in what Bama mixed up when he was late getting out of bed, and this smell of what all was in it, castor oil?
Oh, there was a lot of things, a little bit of kerosene.
Kerosene.
A lot of herbs and things, but it smelled so terrific. I went in there one day and she was urging Jim to get up, and she's taking this medicine to him when he's in bed. This is before going, he loved to sleep in the morning. I mean, that was his greatest fault, I guess. But he got to school every day on time, because nobody would have taken that medicine. I told her she couldn't possibly give it to him. But I don't know if she really intended to give it to him. Maybe she knew that it would work just smelling it.
But Jim eventually then owned the property that had been the McKay Schoolhouse, where Aunt Georgianne had taught, and I guess she lived
right next door to it.
Yeah.
And so there's quite a history.
The McKay School, what Dave is talking about, the McKay School had two locations. From 1912 to 1940, more or less what the building was then is still there now on the Little River Airport Road, just immediately west of Road 21, one of the few road signs that's still there. From about 1890 to 1912, no, just the time that the Macdonalds settled on the ranch, to 1912, the McKay School was located on their ranch right above the river bottom, right above the railroad tracks. And that's where the older Macdonalds and neighbors like the Mathesons, a family that there are no real descendants now, but they should have sort of a history. Just wonderful people. But they went to school there, along with the Gunners, and even Oscar Newman from way out at Keene Summit went to school there at least 1 year.
Yeah.
So.
Also up on the not Navarro, but the Albion Ridge, the people that lived on the properties that now belong to Karen Anderson and maybe some other places, they walked down the hill and attended that school, a whole bunch of them. And actually back on the table there, I think, we may have some of the graduation from high school things from the girls that originally have gone to the McKay School. There are several. There's
also a photo back there of a Model T, which may be John Finley Robertson's Model T.
Right, I watched that every time he came up the hill. He had to open the gate, and the car would, he put on that emergency brake, and it wouldn't quite hold. He would keep, he had to hurry, get back in the car.
Anyway, there's a picture of it going down the road as it looked probably in the 20s to the Macdonald Ranch, which is still, the bottom half of it is somewhat of an adventure today. Many people here can attest
you
to it.
should tell them about the two garages for us.
Well, the youngest, Uncle Charlie, another living saint story, is that when Forrest, the youngest brother, was in high school, Charlie got him a car to drive.
We got both of them.
Yeah, well, got both of them, both Forrest and Lauren, a car.
Not two cars.
But one at a time. Yeah. One at a time. Forrest was supposed to be parking them in the garage halfway up the hill, but for whatever reasons and lack of brakes, there's still a remnant of one of them down by Charlie's cabin, appropriately or ironically, where it came all the way down the hill and smashed to smithereens. But Charlie, being the maybe enabler or something, that too nice, got a second car, and Forrest repeated the process about a year later. All right, thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. teas and coffees in the kitchen area if you want to partake of that. Thank you all for coming.
The Blue River Airport Road.
I'm happy to know because I was worried. From centuries of friends, Quakers, that are against war, against killing, even bad people.
She and I had three She wore ready diamond on it. I learned that she was doing something when she went like this on the table. And then she would go, "Do you need oil?" She was like 85 years old, so nobody.
That's a motley looking crew of kids. Look at that.
There's some other McDonald's in there. Hi, how are you? Real
Yeah, there it is.
He did a nice job in getting through so many years.
That was Irene Mallory. Irene Mallory made up. Irene that's so right there. Oh, yes. Oh, that's the old Moss
Going down the road.
What's that thing come up?
The road's not much different right there. Maybe a little less grass in the middle.
Is there still a road?
Oh, yeah.
Who uses it?
We do. Nobody. Well, I mean, you know, you came to pick berries or something. We will guide you down there.
Have you seen the thing that he has though, that he took out of a tree, that old survey mark? Oh, yeah, that's a berry tree, you know.
Right.
You know, they made these berry trees.
Right, oh, believe me, I know.
Yeah.
This is just up here on the trail. We were able to
You can tell really where it is, you would chaparral on it like that.
Right, and pull it, yeah.
Then you're going to read it with a mirror in order to see what it actually says.
Where was the one that you popped out?
Actually, the one I got at home, I got testing out a branch come up there. There was some log that had been cut down or something. I mean,
Great job.
Oh, really? Yeah.
This redwood.
But I took a lot of others. That was really what I took home.
It's really very good. Hello, Mr. Tim. How you doing? How you doing?
Some days are good, some days aren't as good. Both days aren't real good.
Hey, you did all right.
Thanks from you, that's high praise.
Your mother's a gun runner. I told her she's sort of now I know. She's a gun runner and she does that was lightning. What did I back is like
Oh,
that's why
there was a story of
she told me off.
that place where they were making moonshine below the house. The revenuers came, and then one of the little boys, her cousins, went up to the revenuer as the guy was kind of going around towards the door that would go down. You know, why can't I think of regular words? You know, your storm cellar kind of place where he had the moonshine. The revenuer is getting close to that door, and this little boy cousin says, "Mr. Revenuer, don't go down there. That's where my uncle keeps you still."
Oh, boy.
At which point, like, all of the uncles appeared at once and just sort of stood there, and there was this one government agent by himself, and he just sort of eased his way back to his vehicle or a horse or whatever he had, and he never came back.
Did you ever have a sip out of that jug?
Well,
Now, come on. Let's be honest.
but actually, they went into town once a week on Sunday, got their jugs filled, and took them back, and once a week they went back and got them refilled.